Whenever we're going through life and we're navigating through various storms or challenging seasons, I think we all know intuitively we're called to trust in the Lord, and lean into His providence in those particular moments. But it kind of begs the obvious question, what does that mean? What does it actually mean? What does it actually look like to trust in the Lord? And rather than answer that question by giving you a simple, straightforward definition, I thought a more creative way and poetic way to do it would be to expound upon today's gospel. Parable of the Talents, which you find in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 25. So pretty simple story, right? There's this master who has 3 slaves. He gives each of them varying amounts of so-called talents. First guy gets 5, second guy gets 2, the last guy gets 1. And then he goes off on a journey to a faraway land with the promise that one day in the future, I will come back. Now, before we continue on with the story, I want to clarify certain terms and concepts, right? So first of all, obviously, the notion of a talent. A talent was a unit of measure used in the context of commerce at the time of Christ, roughly the modern-day equivalent of $1.4 million. And that's really important to know, because sometimes we feel bad for the one guy who only gets 1 talent, but he's doing okay. So $1.4 million, right? Now, when it comes to what they're called slaves, right? So it does not imply that these people were beaten or whipped or otherwise physically abused. It denotes a certain understanding of ownership. I don't own myself, I don't own my possessions. And so for the master to give me anything, a cup, a book, never mind like $1.4 million times 5, times 2, times 1. The idea is that I'm blown away by that because I have no prior concept of ownership, and yet the master entrusts to me his possessions, in a certain sense, himself. But then that takes us to the notion of the journey, right? So again, he gives the talents, and he goes off on a journey to a faraway land, right? It's emblematic of the ascension. So Jesus Christ, he suffers and dies on the cross, he comes back from the dead, and then eventually he ascends into heaven, body and soul, to behold his Father in heaven, the beatific vision, right? And the idea is, how do we look at the ascension? I would suggest a lot of people look at the ascension in terms of the Lord has left us to fend for ourselves. He's left us to fend against the evil and wickedness and snares of the devil and the world, but the proper way to look at it is this notion of trust. And you know that because before he goes, again, he gives us the talents. I give you my possessions, the immensity of my possessions and my grace and my gifts and all these different things, not to mention in a certain sense a piece of myself. So what's being implied is stewardship and trust, responsibility. Shades of the words of the father to the elder son in the parable of the prodigal son. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. So again, stewardship, trust, responsibility. Now going back to the story, right? So how do these guys respond? Let's start with the first 2 guys. So the first 2 guys is kind of interesting. They don't allow themselves to be caught up in like egotism or pettiness or like false competition. They recognize intuitively that, okay, we've been given an immensity of this gift, and with that comes expectation. With that comes responsibility. But at the same time, we're on the same team. We serve the same master. We're trying to realize the same goal. The realization of the kingdom of heaven beginning right now in the present moment. So I don't care that, I got 5 and you got 2. Who cares? We have different gifts and talents, complementary tasks to ultimately build up the kingdom of heaven, right? So there's that. As a result of which, the first guy produces 5 more talents, second guy 2 more talents. But then, when it comes to the third guy, he buries his talents in the ground. Then the master comes back and wants to settle accounts with his various slaves, right? And so, just to walk you through this. So with regards to the first 2 slaves, it's kind of interesting. He treats them the same, despite the fact that one guy produced 5 more talents, and the other guy produced 2 more talents. Equal treatment, despite different levels of productivity. Shades of the parable of the dragnet, which you find in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13. So you think back to that particular story, right? So the idea is that a goldfish is not expected to be a shark, and a shark is not expected to be a minnow, right? The expectations placed on me specifically correspond to the grace that I've been given. But then that brings us to the reward, right? So different levels of productivity, but the same reward. And the reward on the face of it is kind of funny. So you've been faithful in a few things. I now entrust you with many things. Enter now into the joy of your master. And you think, that's a weird reward. What's the reward? More work, right? But it goes to the nature of God. So God is so good. When it comes to the end of our lives, what can he give us? Not so much like stuff, not like a pot of gold or a wad of cash. He can only give himself. And so it's 2 sides of the same coin, right? You've been faithful in a few things. I entrust you with many things. Enter now into the joy of your master. The reward is you share more fully in my blessed life. you share more fully in my joy. And how do I find joy? By giving myself away as opposed to clinging, possessing, controlling, or having. But that, of course, brings us to the third slave, right? So again, he says to his master, look, I buried the one talent in the ground because I heard you were harsh. And obviously this accusation of harshness is kind of a red herring. So it begs the question, like, why does he actually bury his one talent in the ground? If you look at the lectionary, it says, you wicked and lazy slave. But is it really laziness? I would suggest no, because it takes a lot of effort to bury a hole in the ground. Right? So it's not so much laziness. The real issue is, I'm just terrified. And that comes from the original Greek, right? So he's afraid, he's terrified, he's timid. And just to kind of pause in that, right? So I've been given many things, many graces, many blessings, and I recognize that with that comes responsibility, expectation, to live fruitful lives, but also to become the person that the Father's calling me to be. And from that perspective, it's infinitely relatable. How many times we go through our lives and it's like, gosh, how am I getting it through the day and the week and the year? Never mind this extra stuff of becoming holy and a saint and becoming the person that God is calling me to be. Like, it just seems like so much. And so the inclination, in a certain sense, is to give up. To give into fear, to give into timidity, anxiety, to bury my talent, to bury my life in the ground before the adventure actually begins. So what does the gospel say in response? There's actually two responses, one which is kind of obvious, the other one not so much, but that's why they pay me the big bucks, right? So when it comes to the obvious response, what the Lord says, what the master says to the third slave is like, look, all you had to do was put the money in the bank and let it collect interest. And that would have been totally fine. And he's kind of shocked by that answer, but we shouldn't be shocked. It's reminiscent of this great quote by St. Jose Maria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei. So basically what he says is, don't go about your life looking to slay fire-breathing dragons. So what he means by that is, you got to have a proper concept as to what the spiritual life is all about. It's not about doing everything in one go, right? I'm going to be holy in one day. I'm going to accomplish this great thing in terms of building up the kingdom of heaven in one solid effort. It's not that, right? It's kind of reflective of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. All those parables dealing with the kingdom of heaven, right? The parable of the weeds and the wheat, the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the leavened bread. The common denominator is focus on the few things the Lord wants you to do carefully and well. Occasionally, the Lord will invite you to deviate from the simple and the humble and the ordinary, but typically not. Stay grounded in your ordinary life. Focus on the few things the Lord wants you to do carefully and well, and trust that over time, that will bear fruit and build up, actually, the kingdom of God. But that takes us to the second response. And again, it's one of those things, you blink and you miss it, right? So you go back to the beginning of the story. Again, the master doles out varying amounts of talents to these three guys. But what you hear is, he does this each according to his ability. Each according to his ability. Now, the key word there is that word which is rendered here as ability. And you hear ability, you think, well, gifts and talents, parable of the talents. But actually, it means something else. It requires an understanding of Greek and an understanding of the entirety of the Bible. So the word which is rendered here as ability is the same word which is used in 2 Peter chapter 1. And basically what it means is the power of Christ working in you. The power of Christ working in you, which adds a little something to the whole story. I go about my life. I'm mindful of the fact that I've been given many things in the spiritual realm, in the temporal realm, and with that comes responsibility and expectation, as a result of which I constantly need to renew my sense of trust in the Lord over and over again in the context of the season of pilgrimage. But again, going back to the original question, what does that mean? What does that look like to trust in the Lord? This might sound kind of counterintuitive, but typically, even though we think about trusting ourselves and trusting God as being separate, in reality, they're one and the same. Deep trust in yourself and deep trust in God are both one and the same thing, because if you break it down and you take it back to the parable, you're not really trusting in yourself. What you're trusting in is the power of Jesus Christ working in you. You're trusting and leaning heavily into the power of Jesus Christ working in you. What he's begun in time, I trust and believe with all my heart, he will bring to completion. In other words, I believe, quite frankly, that God is just that much more powerful. And so regardless of what I'm going through in terms of the world, or even the earthquake, which is my own heart, evil and wickedness and selfishness and sin, God's power to heal and forgive and restore and make things new is just that much more powerful. And so I can trust that. I can lean into that. Nothing will separate you from the love of Christ.